Hello. Today we'll have our third installment in this little phenomenology course. It's the third lecture on Kant, on the critique of pure reason specifically. I want to begin by reflecting a little bit on what we've already done in order to set up what I want to do today. And so I want to talk about essentially the steps we've gone through. In the two lectures I've given so far, I see myself as having made three essential points, or have discussed three essential topics. Today will be the fourth one, and I'll also kind of announce a fifth one. And those, I think, pretty much map out the trajectory or the shape of Kant's overall position, which is my goal. Anyway, so we began with the study of the fourth paralogism from the A edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And that was the first step in our process. And what we were trying to do there was to get ourselves to change our perspective on what's already happening every day, and to notice the fact of our experience, and to notice its character as experience. We were trying to say something about, at a very basic level, what the fact of experience is like. Or let me put that a different way. There you were working, running around in the world doing things, and sitting on chairs and breathing air and buying groceries and whatever else. And the thing is, at no point were you doing anything other than experiencing. So that's what we initially noticed, that our being thrown out into the world is our experiencing. They're the same thing. We said it in the other direction when we, at that time, we said our experience is being thrown out into the world. But they're the same point. And so the point, the central claim of the fourth paralogism, the central point we were trying to make, was, to put that same thing in slightly different language, that experience is not representational. That our experience is not a matter of constructing for ourselves some kind of inner representation of something that's outside, but rather our experience is fundamentally a matter of being thrown out into the world. That's the form our experience takes. I read a quotation from Sartre's Being and Nothingness. I believe in that first lecture, where he says something to the effect of consciousness has no content. And I think that's quite a helpful way to hold on to this, right? To be conscious, to be aware, to be experiencing is not to be entertaining something of your own, some content of consciousness. It is to find yourself thrown out into things. So consciousness is the experience of being thrown into the world. The language of thrown, I guess, primarily comes from Heidegger. That's older than that. And so, I'm turning there to Sartre and Heidegger for the language that I think really captures well this point. But the point is the point of Kant's fourth paralogism. So Sartre and Heidegger are really, I think, saying quite effectively that fundamental point that Kant is trying to get you to notice in the fourth paralogism, which I think maybe. I think that's a pretty revolutionary point. I don't really think of someone before Kant as making that point explicitly. It may be implied in other people's positions, but Kant sees a reason to assert that, and I think that's a quite original move, and I think that is the beginning of the tradition of phenomenology, as we understand it. That's why I began there. Anyway, I said I wanted to go through the basic structure. I said there are 3 points so far, and I wanted to mention 2 more. So that first one was that we were turning ourselves to noticing the simple fact of experience. The second point, also from that first week, was the central topic of the section of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason called the Transcendental Aesthetic. And that the idea there was that our experience always takes the form of being confronted by a kind of it is there. And the it is there is basically time and space. we find ourselves immediately confronted with a spatial and temporal is. Words are a bit tricky here because sometimes the words we want to use to say things clearly bring in other implications that we don't want to have there, and that's why I stumble a little bit over what I should say that spatial and temporal thing is. But we're confronted with space and time. I guess that's what I should say. That's the basic raw given of experience. It's basically what Kant calls appearance, the undetermined object of empirical intuition. That's what we are initially confronted with. That's what we intuit. And where intuit means what we immediately and directly contact. And that was the second point then. The third point, which was the subject of the second lecture, was that space and time, that appearance or undetermined object of empirical intuition, that direct whatever that we encounter, is also something that we encounter as having a kind of sense or significance. That's not something we make up. We don't make sense of it in the sense of creating this, sorting it out for ourselves. Rather, it is the case that we confront that as having a sense, but that sense that it has is again not, or I shouldn't say again, is not again a matter of something that we directly confront. It's rather the deeper sense of what that is, and here's where I use that word is. And this has to do with what Kant calls the categories of existence. Just a reminder. So I experience that directly intuited spatial and temporal whatever as the world, as the world of nature. And roughly, the core meaning of that is I experience it as something that has its own way of being organized, has its own source, has its own reasons for being there, et cetera, works according to its own rules. So I precisely experience it as not something that goes the way it does because of my subjectivity or the way I think about things or my desire or wills or anything like that. So I experience it as objective. So my experience, the very form my experience takes is the encounter with the object, with objectivity. My experience in that sense is my subjectivity, my subjective experience is in that sense objective in its very nature. The very form our experience takes is the encounter with the real. So I was talking about the encounter with the real from the very beginning, but that special theme of what it is to be real in the rich sense, that's the third point. Right. So the first point, so just to quickly recap those three things. The first point is to notice the fact of our experience as a matter of being thrown outside ourselves. The second point is that our experience is always immediately confronting space and time. The third point is that there's a further, for lack of a better word, layer to our experience, which is that the space and time is there's a what to it, a whatness to it. And the what of it is the essentially self-organizing or self-determining world of nature. And that is a matter of, that's something that is a task for us to understand, right? Because we're precisely confronted with something where that has this meaning for us. There's something here that operates on its own terms, and they're not the terms that you can just make up in your own head. So you'd have to go and learn it and study it to figure out what it is. So nature presents us with the task of understanding it in that sense. So that's the third point. So I hope those three things are basically clear. I used the fourth paralogism to introduce us basically to what I would describe in 20th century language as the phenomenal. Well, actually, yeah, in 20th century language, I would describe it as the phenomenological project of describing our experience in the form in which it is lived. It's actually pretty close to the language that Hegel uses in 1806 and 1807 in the Phenomenology of Spirit. So maybe I shouldn't call it 20th century language, but we'll talk about that later. But in any case, that's what I used the fourth paralogism for. Then we looked at the part of his book that's really the transcendental aesthetic, which is the discussion of the direct form of the form of what we directly encounter, namely space and time, spatial and temporal specificity. The third point is really the transcendental analytic, or transcendental logic, the sense that there is a what to it that is a matter not of directly intuiting but of understanding. And now we want to turn to the fourth point, which is really something like the third layer of experience. If there's layer one is space and time of aesthetic, of the transcendental aesthetic, if layer two is the meaning that this is a world of nature, the subject of transcendental logic, now we're going to talk about reason and with a section of the book called the Transcendental Dialectic, which is really the further dimension of our experience where we grapple with the question, and what is the ultimate answer to everything, roughly. That's what we're going to talk about today. The fifth point, which I'm going to introduce today, but not really talk about, and I'm not going to have another lecture, but I'll send you to one, is really about the theme of morality that will emerge out of that, and the whole world of our moral experience. So the four quite separate points I think you need to hold on to are the points from the transcendental aesthetic that we directly intuit space and time. The second point from the transcendental logic, that that spatial and temporal whatever is presented to us as the world of nature. And that's a matter of understanding, not grasping nature as nature is a matter of using concepts and ideas, matters of understanding, not a matter of simple intuitive direct apprehension. The natureness of nature is not something you intuit, right? The spatial and temporal distribution of whatever is. Whereas appearance is an undetermined object of empirical intuition, nature is how that appearance is determined, made concrete and specific through the rich, meaningful, conceptual, logical parameters that define something as real and so on. Third, the way we try to go beyond that whole thing, the world of nature that is presented to us in space and time, and ask about the ultimate questions about that, about what it is, where it comes from, and so on. That's the third layer. And then, in getting into that domain of our grappling with ultimates, that's where we encounter a very different form of experience, which is our moral experience. It's very different than the cognitive experience we have of trying to apprehend what is there. Something very different in moral experience, which is really the grappling with the question of what ought to be the case. It's really the question of the good. As I said, I'm going to announce that today, but I'm not really going to talk about it. But it's important that those four things be held apart. Anyway, what we're going to talk today about is that third element. If we had sensibility or the aesthetic, if we had understanding or logic, now we're going to talk about reason. And just to give you a little outline of what we're going to do, I'm specifically going to focus on only one part of this huge, that's the biggest part of the book, I think, the discussion of reason. We're only going to focus on one thing, and that's his discussion of what he calls the third antinomy. So Kant talks about studies are concerned with ultimates, which I'll say something about, and really identifies three really different kinds of ultimate that we struggle with, which roughly, what ultimately am I, what ultimately is the nature of reality, and then how ultimately do all those things fit together, roughly. we're going to focus only on a portion of the one where he asks about essentially the nature of reality. The first section about the nature of the eye is the section of the paralogism. So we did actually talk about it, but we didn't really take it up in the way in which he's interested in bringing it out there, which is as a study of the problems in the way we try to reason about things. So the paralogism was a kind of reasoning we engage in to come to certain conclusions, and he's trying to show that those paralogisms are wrong. That's part of his study of the problems we get into when we get into this question of reasoning about ultimates. So we touched on that, but we're not really going to talk about. We're going to talk about the antinomies, which is the second one. This is where we, as I said, grapple with questions about the nature of the object, as opposed to the paralogisms, which were really trying to argue about the nature of ourselves as subjects. And I'm going to focus on the third antinomy. So there are actually four of them. I'm not going to talk about the other three, interesting as they are. I'm only going to talk about the third one because it captures well enough the pivotal issue of the antinomies. And that one also, in the way it ends up unfolding, is pretty definitive or decisive for grasping the thing I mentioned before, the overall structure of Kant's project. And it's kind of a hinge, so to speak, for something. So the third antinomy is both a piece of a larger argument that's interesting in its own right, but the significance it has is huge for understanding our experience in general. So that's why we're going to look at that one. And once we've got through that, I guess this is kind of what I was getting at all along here. Once we've got through that, you basically have the story of Kant's philosophy. There's a tremendous amount more to learn and study there. But if you've got through that, starting with the fourth paralogism, you got through the basic point of the aesthetic, the basic point of the logic, and now this basic point of the third antinomy as a study of reason, you have pretty much the map of our experience. There's a great deal more to explore and to learn in all those domains, but there isn't exactly something to add. There you've got the thing that Kant's going to say, so you can listen to him say it more fully and more deeply, but you know what he's saying. Anyway, so let me so that's then what we're going to do. So to begin our actual study now, I want to go back to a couple of points I've made in those first two lectures. I just made them, along the way, but it's worth going back now and taking it up seriously, and seeing that there's an important thread to be pursued there. So it began the very first week when we talked about the notion of outside, and we noticed that there's a kind of the outside is a kind of equivocal word. It can be used in more than one way. It means something different depending on the context in which it's being used and so on. And so within our experience, outside means something. And basically, it's pretty much the only meaning you ever engage with, right? The world is outside you. That's a truth within your experience. So that's the normal meaning of outside. That's the normal experiential meaning outside. The normal experiential meaning of outside, namely that this room is outside me, and outside this room, but it's in the house, and outside the house is the front yard and the street and so on, and that outside goes on and on and on and on. Right? That's the normal meaning outside. But so that is the meaning of outside as it functions within experience. But we can also ask about what reality is like outside experience, and that's a different meaning. The point of the fourth paralogism is to say that this kind of skeptical representationalist paradox that people get wrapped up in come from conflating illegitimately those two meanings, right? From posing the question in the form of what is, in the second sense, what is outside experience, asking a question about that, and yet acting as if what is outside us as that is meaningful within experience is what is being studied and what is being questioned, and that's just a logical error. It's a logical error that pervades everyday thinking. It is the foundation of reflection for probably 40% of maybe 80% of professional philosophy teachers. I mean, in other words, it's not a trivial error. It's a mistake that it's an error that overwhelmingly shapes people's thinking, which is why it's worthy of being included as a major portion of this critique of pure reason that is the basic study of the issues philosophy has to deal with, to show that that's an error. Anyway, I don't need to go on about that. I was bringing that up because Kant is saying these kinds of errors he's going to talk about errors in reasoning, some errors in reasoning that we make, and he's going to say, like, these are so to speak endemic to reason. They're insofar as we're beings who try to reason and think about things, it's pretty much guaranteed we're going to get caught up in these problems. That's sort of what the Transcendental Dialectic of the Critique of Pure Reason is builds from. But anyway, the point I wanted to make, though, was to go back to that and say that's an equivocal. Well, there's an equivocation in that argument because the word outside is equivocal. It means two different things, and it's crucial to us. And this was the point I made in that lecture, and I've reiterated. It's crucial to us if we're doing philosophy and phenomenological philosophy in particular to notice that equivocation and not be guilty of it. Right? To be clear on whether we're talking about the form in which experience is lived outside as a meaning within experience, or another question we might try to ask about what is outside experience, which means something different, and it's not entirely clear that we even know what we mean when we ask that. Although maybe there is a sense, and we'll come back to that. This came up again in the second lecture when I mentioned this with respect to concepts. I also mentioned it with respect to understanding and imagination. I can't remember the other terms I used, but I just sort of rolled these out and said, look, these are all words where what we've seen is we need to be careful when we're using these words to remember they function differently when we're talking about them as they are at play within experience versus when we're talking about them as constitutive of the very structure of experience. So, I focused on concepts. Kant distinguishes empirical concepts and a priori or transcendental concepts, and he wants to look at those latter ones. But so I said, our everyday use of concept is this way we have of turning our subjective powers to thinking about something we encounter in the world, grasping it according to a principle or a rule, or holding it together with other things or something like that, the normal sense of conceptualizing something. Well, Kant says, cause and effect is a concept too. Unity is a concept. Plurality is a concept. Totality is a concept. Those are concepts too, and they are concepts we can use in our everyday thinking, for sure. But they're concepts that, in a sense, and that there's that relevant expression, we have already used them in experiencing a world at all, in experiencing an object at all. So there, the world is already conceptualized, or the appearance is the undetermined object of empirical intuition is already conceptualized, i.e., determined, in our immediate having of experience. There, it's already conceptualized, or we already used concepts. We can say, but you got to put those things in scare quotes because you never used them. You didn't exist as an experiencing subject until that conceptualizing had already happened. And so there I was stressing that when we're talking about words like understanding or concept or use or whatever, what we end up doing is taking words or expressions that have an active meaning within experience, but they in fact are describing a fundamentally passive dimension of our experience when we are talking about their role as part of the, for lack of a better expression, intrinsic structure of experience. Anyway, I'm just reminding you of those things. We talked about them already, so I don't need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. But I'm trying to remind you that we've come up come to a number of places already where we've noticed that we basically have to be speaking at two levels, and and we're going to use the same language in a certain way at both levels because we're going to speak English or German in Kant's case, but the meaning of the words we use changes in significant ways depending on what level we're speaking at. This, again, as I said about the meaning of reality before, this isn't a puzzle. There's stuff to learn about it. There's a lot to learn from studying it, but it's not like it's not magic. Requires intelligence and thought to figure it out, but you can. So there's nothing secret or tricky here, but it's a matter of being carefully attentive to what we're doing, to remembering what it is that you're talking about when you're talking, and to use the language appropriately. So this is we're actually then encountering something that's I'll use this word again, endemic, to phenomenological philosophy. What the fourth paralogism launched for us was the project of basically describing our experience on the terms in which it happens. But that's not. But there we are self-consciously, thematically, and explicitly describing our experience as experience. So normally that's not what happens. Normally I say there's a car driving down the street. There I am describing the real object in the world. When I'm describing my experience as experience, I would say, oh, look at that. I can now notice that the form my experience takes is I was recognizing a car driving down the road. There's the same experience is talked about in both cases, but in one case you're kind of living in that experience and not thematizing the fact that it is experience, but instead just describing the object as it is given in experience. In the second case, you're dealing with exactly the same experience, but what you're thematizing is the fact that it is an experience in which an object is given. And so you're describing exactly the same thing, but your focus is a bit different, and that requires a bit of a change in the way you use language and so on. And when we then turn to that experience and are interested in it as experience, we can then ask, as we did, I'll use the language I used before, for lack of a better language. When we want to talk about the fabric of that experience as experience, we have to use different terms and different concepts than when we are focusing on the object and are interested in the way that object as an object of our as an object works. Right. So the car, works with pistons and the combustion of gasoline and steering rods and brake pads and stuff like that. The experience of a car doesn't have those things. The experience of a car is it, in fact, has empirical and pure intuition. It has pure concepts. It has apperception. It has all kinds of other things. It has the structures that experience has. It has the structures of the flow of temporal happening, subjective flow of temporal happening that we talked about last week. Anyway, so I'm just reviewing, but I'm reviewing with the specific point here, and that is to clearly mark out these two different ways we can talk about the same thing, the experience we're having, but depending on whether we're interested in the object of the experience or the experience of the object. Same thing, but different focus. And depending on our focus, the meaning of our terms, of our language, changes quite significantly. So we have, in our philosophical phenomenological investigation, been, I hope, very responsible in our use of concepts and language, because we have been very self-conscious about the fact that we are taking up our experience as experience, and that we are describing it in the actual terms that it happens, and so on. So we have noticed the equivocity of language, etc., and recognized the difference between these two different sort of domains that we can be addressing, and been rigorous in our efforts to be consistent and careful in how we handle those things. But that's not what everyday life is like. In everyday life, I notice the car going down the street. Well, let's not say I, because I'm practiced at doing phenomenology, so I'm not a normal person anymore. But in everyday life, a normal person notices a car going down the street and doesn't notice, oh, my experience takes the form of recognizing a car going down the street. And so a normal person hasn't usually carefully drawn and studied that distinction between those two ways of taking up what's happening in her or his experience. And a normal person will also then, normal people, come up with questions that are sort of philosophical. We're doing it well, but normal people do it poorly, but they do it. And so a normal person will come up with philosophical questions, and that person will use concepts from everyday life and try to use them in ways that don't respect the shift of meaning that happens when you try to jump outside experience. So I started with the fourth paralogism because I've said this before, but now I want to actually make it a sort of a substantive point. The fourth paralogism really is how people think. People really are transcendental realists, whereas they should be transcendental idealists, which means they experience a real world outside them as they should, but they don't notice the fact that that is inherently defined by the fact that it is a matter of experience. And because they're transcendental realists, when they do notice that they are experiencing subjects, they use the terms of the object of experience, the causal structure we impute to the undetermined object of empirical intuition, right? The causal structure of nature and reality. They use that to try to interpret their own subjectivity, and they become empirical idealists, roughly, representationalist theoreticians of consciousness who are therefore ultimately skeptics. And so, as Kant said in the fourth paralogism, transcendental realism and empirical idealism are two sides of the same phenomenon. Phenomenon is the right word because it is a way of experiencing, but they're two sides of the same way of interpreting our situation. They contradict each other, or I guess they don't exactly contradict each other, but the sort of you have to be sort of in contradiction to buy into them, because you both have to assert that there's a real world outside you and also claim that you have no basis for asserting it. But those are the positions people flop around in, and they say, and that's where people's problems come from. They say, how do I know that I'm in the world? Like, there's the world, I should think in those terms. Oh, but maybe I'm a subject, maybe I'm lost in my own mind, and they can't figure out how to put those two things together. But remember, I was saying this is a sort of substantive point. Well, it is that way of thinking that then that most of the world lives by most of the time, that then further sort of problems get built on. So we do ask this kind of, we take the concept, two poorly begun sentences, let me start again. We then take the question of causality that we rightly ask of the object of our experience. How does that car engine work? Why is there black smoke coming out of the exhaust pipe? Causal questions for connecting, trying to understand the connected sequence of experiences in the flow of our experience of the natural world, our scientific effort to understand causes. We take that proper way of grappling with the object of experience, and then we ask, well, what caused nature, right? Or in a similar way, we sort of try to understand how nature caused our experience, right? In both cases, we're taking the concept of cause that rightly functions in our study of the object of experience, and on the one case, well, let me do those in reverse order. In the one case, basically turning it on our own experience and trying to understand our experience by the terms of the object of experience, which is then a real mistaken understanding of how those things relate. On the other hand, to the first example I gave, now taking it up second, we take that notion of cause that is what defines the functionings, so to speak, internal to nature, and we try to take it outside of our experience of nature and ask an ultimate question about nature itself. I'm going to talk about those examples a bit more, so this will become clearer. But I hope even in just saying that, you can both recognize that these are normal, everyday things thinking people do, and it makes sense that they do, because they're rational people. They want to understand things and they apply their concepts to these things, but that the concepts are being significantly misapplied because, due to a failure to make that appropriate first phenomenological move that Kant outlines in the fourth Paralogism, and recognize the fact of experience on its own terms and so on, because of a failure to do that, there is a real confusion of the relationship between experience and what is actually an object of experience, but let's use the word we normally use for nature. There's a confusion of the relationship between experience and nature, rather than being taken up as a presentation, as a form in which our experience is happening. It's being taken up as what Kant calls a thing in itself, which may be a technical term, but I think mostly it's a language that should just sound kind of familiar and could make sense of it. So again, I would say there, don't be concerned, at least not now, about the technicalities of that. Just think about the sort of point that's being made, and the point is being made is a very everyday point. It's the way people talk. So Kant's ultimately going to take up that issue of the thing itself and talk about it rigorously and carefully, and there'll be things to learn there. But right now, let's just use it the way Betty on the street might use it. Like you could make sense of that. But you can see the error. What is actually a presentation is being mistakenly construed not as a presentation, but just as a thing in itself, something not defined by the context of experience, even though it is defined by the context of experience. And then the relationship between that thing and experience is being brought up. So it's either in relationship to itself or in relationship to experience. The question of cause is being asked in a way that fundamentally misunderstands and misrepresents the relationship between nature and experience. So what I've done is I've gone back and I've talked about mostly some of the issues from that fourth paralogism, but I've used that as a way to talk about how we take concepts that function properly within experience and try to use them in denial of that essential context of experience which makes them meaningful. And we can do that either by treating nature, in this example, not as a presentation but as a thing in itself. In other words, the essential context of experience in which nature is given is being ignored. Or we can ignore that context and then still take up experience, but mistakenly notice the fact of our experience and construe it as if it were simply a phenomenon of nature to be understood on the terms of nature, rather than understanding it on the contrary as the very context within which any of this happens. So we misconstrue our own subjectivity. And so there you have the transcendental realism and the empirical idealism point that Kant made in the fourth paralogism being played out now at the level of using the concept of cause from experience to try to understand nature, either in its own ultimate character or in relationship to subjectivity. I went through that because I think that should all be pretty familiar. You should think, yeah, I understand those questions that people ask. I recognize that we do that all the time. Should be able to recognize the structures that I'm saying, but it also should be the case if you've been working on this material from Kant for the last couple of weeks. It should be the case that you see the problem there, that you now have learned why somebody's not being very careful about the meaning of the words and about the character of experience. So there, I was picking up on things we've already talked about to take you from things you should already be able to make sense of to the point Kant wants to make. I've been trying to introduce the central theme of the third part of the book, the Transcendental Dialectic. I've been trying to introduce that through those things that should already be familiar to you now. So now let me say more in the terms in which Kant says it, what the Transcendental Dialectic is about. He says it's about reason. And I've already introduced the notion of reason basically when I said earlier it's about trying to figure out ultimates. I'm not going to talk in much more detail about reason. It's a great topic. I'm going to refer you later to another lecture I have on YouTube that does talk about that more. But I'm not going to get into it now because it's not essential for our purposes. But the point is simply this. It's when we try to take a way of thinking to the end. So normally you think about things in kind of conditioned ways, like you accept a whole circumstance and then you try to figure out something in a limited way. Like you try to figure out why black smoke is coming out of the tailpipe of the car, but you don't try to situate that and learn about the whole context of causality such that you understand where smoke comes from, where cars come from, and why there's something rather than nothing and whatever else. You just want to figure out what's going on in the combustion chamber of the engine such that black smoke is coming out when the gasoline is combusting. So it's a very local question. And in that sense, it's a conditioned use of thinking. But sometimes we want to think past those conditioned contexts to the unconditioned, the ultimate, right? And that is when we go from the black smoke to the car, to nature, to why is there something rather than nothing or whatever, right? We want to take it to the very end. And so we're doing something there that's very like understanding in the sense that it's the application of a concept or something, but it's something very distinctive. The distinctiveness of it is that it revolves around our capacity as human beings to entertain and engage with the notion of the ultimate. The idea that something could be meaningful unconditionally, without qualification. And that particular ability, that particular ability to engage with the unconditional sense of things. That's basically what reasoning is, or what reason is. I started to say reasoning. Reasoning is a little different. That's when you move from premise to conclusion, or from the ultimate to what comes from the ultimate, or whatever. So that's a practice or a process. But reason itself is, I want to say, is more like just that basic ability that we as human beings have to think in terms of ultimates, to grasp ultimate meanings. By ultimate, I mean unconditioned, absolute meanings. So we have that capacity as human beings, and another way of saying that is that the question of the ultimate is always alive for you. Aristotle begins book one of the metaphysics. I was going to say the metaphysics, and then I thought, well, maybe he doesn't begin the metaphysics because the metaphysics isn't exactly a book. It's a whole bunch of different treatises put together, and who knows what order they're supposed to be in. So we make it the first book of our collection called the Metaphysics, but it may just be a book in its own right. So anyway, the first sentence of book one of the Metaphysics is, all human beings by nature strive toward knowing. Usually people say all men by nature desire to know. It's an older translation. It's pretty familiar. Has some problems in it. So that's why I gave a slightly different version. But yeah, human beings desire to know. Like there's a kind of constitutive striving that Aristotle is identifying as part of the meaning of human nature. We talked about how we're going to talk about nature before. I'm not going to get back into that, but the thing Aristotle is saying is very similar to what Kant here is identifying in terms of the basic questions that are already being asked, and that asking of those questions is part of the very fabric of what it is for us to be experiencing. And when we ask those questions as ultimates, and so you have a meaningful experience of yourself as the one who's here noticing things, but you want to move. You naturally are impelled to want to move from your relatively immediate sense of that to a grasp of what the ultimate nature of yourself is. You have an immediate sense of this world around you, but you're impelled to want to understand the ultimate nature of that thing. Right? And that's there. What you will be trying to do is you'll be trying to move from what is given in experience. You're going to try to move beyond that to something that isn't actually given in experience, but it's going to solve the puzzle. It's going to be the ultimate answer. So that's with reason, with the fact that we are rational beings. We want to do that. We desire to know what is the ultimate nature of the self. We desire to know what is the ultimate nature of the world. And we try to figure those things out. And to try to figure those things out, we use, what else would we do? We use the resources that are available to us within experience for making sense of the local terms in which being a self unfolds and in which being the object natural world unfolds. We use those terms and try to push them beyond merely local understandings to ultimate understandings. We try to take the causal rules for making sense of why black smoke is coming out of the tailpipe of the car. We try to push that. So I'm going to move to the car. I'm going to move to petroleum. I'm going to move to gravity. I'm going to move to whatever. And we think if we keep pushing that, we're going to be able to answer the ultimate question of, the very nature of reality or something like that. Or similarly with respect to ourselves. Basically, we take concepts that properly function within the conditions of experience, and we try to use them in an unconditioned form. Try to find the ultimate and absolute. And the basic point then that Kant wants to make in the section of the book called the Transcendental Dialectic is there, what reason does is use concepts that apply within experience, and it tries to take them outside of experience to answer ultimate questions. And when it does that, it gets in trouble. It says things that it comes to conclusions that are sophistical. They're I'm reluctant to say false because there are a couple of qualifications, as you will see, a couple of important ones. But basically, we get caught up in tricks and traps and sophisms because the reason I gave before, we do that based on a transcendental, realist, empirical, idealist interpretation of experience, a wrong interpretation of experience. And we try to take things that work within experience and take them beyond experience. But we don't pay attention. We don't notice the essential context that is experience, which Kant noticed and what we began with in the fourth Paralogism. And that's why we've been doing things rigorously. But that's what we usually don't do. So we are driven by our nature as rational beings to ask questions in which we take the terms of our experience and try to extend them beyond the terms of any possible experience to find ultimate answers. And and that's a losing game. It doesn't work, and that's what the section on reason is about. But it's systematic and rigorous and brilliantly insightful. And what Kant wants to show is that there are really three, as I said before, three basic ways we end up asking that question. I'm not going to talk about the third one, but he bases them on structures of syllogism, the categorical syllogism, the hypothetical syllogism, and the disjunctive syllogism, as does Hegel in his Logic at another point, which is great, very smart. I'm not going to get into it. But really, he sort of shows that there are three different kinds of reasoning you might be involved in, and that's going to lead you to these three ultimate questions. So he's very systematic about showing what you're going to ask, what these questions ultimately are going to be. And then he follows out what happens when you ask those questions. And there is something important to learn in each case. And the results of the questions about the self and the soul are different than the questions about the world and so on. That's probably the biggest part of the critique of pure reason, and so it really is, in a way, what the book is ultimately about, and highly worthy of study. But because my point here has been more to kind of introduce the shape of Kant's philosophy while launching us into phenomenology, I'm not particularly going to get into those things. But that's what's going to happen. What I want to take us to is one particular way in which we do that, which I've already been revolving around in some of the things I've been saying. So I want to take us to the third antinomy. The antinomies are the places that we basically end up finding ourselves committed to contradictory conclusions when we try to reason about the ultimate nature of the object of our experience. And the question, so as I said, what we do is we take the structures of intelligibility, the concepts that function within our experience, and we've seen them already in the table of categories, the concepts of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Those are the parameters of the real. Those articulate the parameters of the real. We take those notions and try to push each one from its conditioned meaning to its unconditioned meaning. And so there's a finite number of particular things we argue about and particular conclusions we come to. It has to do, but basically there are four, because we do things with quantity, we do things with quality, we do things with relation, and we do things with modality. The earlier questions are more like, how big is the universe, or how big is reality, or how small can it be? Does it have a smallest piece? Can it be? Is it infinitely divisible? Like you can keep dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing forever and ever and ever, or is there a smallest? And the same with big. Those are kinds of questions we ask, and they're very interesting and very important. Those are the ones we're not going to talk about. We're going to talk exclusively about one that pertains to cause. We could also look at the ones about modality, necessity, possibility, and actuality. We could wonder whether there's a necessary existent, things like that. But we're going to focus on the ones about cause, which is about understanding the ultimate source of things, the ultimate cause of things. And so that's the third antinomy. The reason I wanted to mention those other ones, though, is because I wanted to help you see why there would be four. There's, one is pushing our thought about the object to the unconditioned based on the categories of quantity, pushing our thought about the object to the unconditioned based upon the categories of quality, based upon the categories of relation, based upon the categories of modality. Right? Those would be the four routes our thinking would try to take, and the four ways we're going to get in trouble. That each one of these things ends up leading us to a contradiction that I'm not going to try to prove. You can read the book if you want to see that. But I'm going to talk about the particular contradiction we get wrapped up in when we do the cause one. So I'm going to turn to that next. Before I do that, I want to just read one passage just to introduce this. This is from the section of the book called Phenomena and Noumena, which comes, it's one of the last sections before we get into reason. He's sort of closing off off what he said about concepts and so on. He's about to move into reason. But I just want to read a little bit about that. It's a great section. But I want to read one thing there just to remind you of a few things I've already said, but I want to just associate it with a sentence here. And so this is from A 237, which is B 296, and in the Kemp Smith translation, it's page 258. So I'm going to read a little bit, and jumping into Kant's language out of the blue is always going to be a little bit confusing, but I'll read a little bit and then I'll say some things about it. So he says, for experience obtains its unity only from, this. Incidentally, this is, if you're following along in the book, this is 7 lines down on page 258. For experience obtains its unity only from the synthetic unity which the understanding originally and of itself, it was worth holding on to those words, originally and of itself confers upon the synthesis of imagination in its relation to apperception. So there he's basically just saying, we've studied the rules that experience is going to function by in how it holds together the flow of experience that is your perspective. Then he says, and the appearances as data for a possible knowledge. Well, okay, appearances, the undetermined objects of empirical intuition, that's what you're always going to be dealing with. So the experience is always going to be the appearances organized by the structures of imagination holding together, synthesizing, and understanding, synthesizing, that pull this together as something that can be for you a single coherent experience. And the appearances as data for a possible knowledge must already stand a priori in relation to and in agreement with that synthetic unity. So that little paragraph, I just want to read, I'm not going to go back over it, but that kind of summarizes what we've said last week and the week before, talking about transcendental intuition, transcendental analytic. Now, now we get to the thing. But although these rules of understanding are not only true a priori, but are indeed the source of all truth, that is, of the agreement of our knowledge with objects, inasmuch as they contain in themselves the ground of the possibility of experience viewed as the sum of all knowledge wherein objects can be given to us. The rules of understanding, which are derived from those categories, the principles as rules for interpreting our experience, those are what define the object such that we are given a world of nature and so on. And then they also then dictate to us the rules to follow in making sense of that thing. And so anytime you're ever going to want to know the truth about things, you're going to work according to those concepts, right? You will bring your experience to knowledge of objects when you think by the rules of quantity and quality and relation and modality and so on, right? So those are the rules that both define how the object is given to you, and then set out the task for what it takes to get to know in a reflective sense that object you already know in the sense of it being given to you in a meaningful form. Anyway, so although these rules of understanding are not only true a priori, but are indeed the source of all truth, we are not satisfied with the exposition merely of that which is true, right? So these things allow us to come to explicit knowledge of the character of the world as it is given to us in experience. We're not satisfied with the exposition merely of that which is true, but we likewise demand that account be taken of that which we desire to know. So that's, I'm not going to read any more from that. That's all I wanted to read you, but as him stating the thing I was talking about for about 20 minutes, right? That we desire to know things And that desire to know comes from our nature as rational beings. And we just assume, expect, hope that the ways we can make sense of things within experience will allow us to answer those questions. But that's a bringing together of those things that we do, right? It is not the case that the simple fact that we can know the world of our experience, that we can learn things about nature. We can figure out gravity, we can figure out how to build airplanes, whatever else. It is not the case that the fact that we can have knowledge of the world of nature as we experience it means that we can answer all the questions we want to answer. On the contrary, there are many questions you will never be able to answer. Many things you will never know. So I just wanted to read that. Now I want to jump to the third antinomy as a way that comes up. So here I'm jumping to the actual discussion of the antinomy on A444 and 445. That's where it starts. Two pages side by side, which is B472 and 473. And page 409 in the Kemp Smith translation. Before I read some of it, I just want to say then what's going to happen. So here we're going to go to that thing I already talked about. You look at nature and you ask an ultimate question. You say, what's the ultimate cause? And he says you're going to get to the very way that the concept of cause functions means that when you try to do this, you're going to be led to two answers that contradict each other, and each is equally as compelling as the other. They're equally compelling. And it's pretty straightforward. It's as simple as this, and you probably had this thought and you probably took it up in school. So first you would say, well, there must be a first cause, because if the principle of causality means that a thing is only there because it was caused, so you wouldn't have anything unless something caused it. But you have something, so it must have been caused by something, and that thing must have been caused by something. But you can't go on and on forever. If everything you're getting to was always caused by something else, then whatever you have hasn't yet explained where that thing came from. So if you can't get back to a starting point, then you can't ever have anything, because anything you would have tried to explain by a cause actually wouldn't be explained by that thing, since that thing has to be explained by something else, that thing has to be explained by something else. And if there weren't a first, then the question of where did this ever come from would always be deferred, but it would never have been instantiated at all, and therefore there wouldn't be anything. So if the very fact that there is something means there must have been a first cause, that's roughly what he calls the thesis side. But I put it in sort of negative terms, as he sort of does too in his argument. But then the thesis is, the positive thesis is, there must be a first cause which is not itself caused. Or said otherwise, there must be something itself which is uncaused. There must be something that spontaneously of itself gave rise to other things without there being some further cause you could present for that. That should be a sort of familiar thing. The antithesis, the other thing that we're brought to is the idea that no, but the very notion of causality means there can't be a first cause, because whatever that first thing is, you'd have to say, yeah, but where did it come from? How did that get going, right? And the very principle of understanding that says you can't make sense of a thing unless you know why it's there, means that you can't have that thing. You can't even understand what sense it would mean to say that. You've got to be able to answer the why it's there. So the principle of causality points equally to the necessity for and the impossibility of a first cause. In other words, if you presume either that there is a first cause or that there isn't, the concept of causality is incoherent, right? You can't justify and explain that principle. It can't work with either thing involved. If there is a first cause that is not self-caused by something else, well, then you violated the whole principle of causality. And so causality is the thing that you said is always true is not always true. It's something that doesn't make sense. If, on the other hand, you don't have a first cause, well, then you can't have any causality at all. So causality is a concept that, when pushed to being taken up in unconditioned terms, not just in a local way, did this cause that, where you take everything as given and you're just trying to figure out the relationship between A and B. But when you try to take it to the ultimate level, you see that concept doesn't work. It requires and simultaneously is contradicted by each of two different things. That it both requires that there be a first cause and it requires that there not be one. And if you have either one, it doesn't work. Right? So that's the third antinomy. And so the way that relates to nature is you're either going to imagine there was a spontaneous first cause that brought this into being, or you're going to say no, eternally it's always been happening already, right? And both of those things are ultimately nonsense. They're meaningless. They're both pretty much meaningless statements that you can't really make any sense of. You can say the words in either case, but in each case, all you're doing is taking a concept that makes sense within the terms of experience, where you're explaining how this phenomenon, black smoke coming out of the exhaust pipe, is explained by this other phenomenon, the fact that there's a combustion chamber with pistons and spark plugs, and there's gasoline, and there's also valves keeping the oil out, but there's some oil leaking. I guess that would be giving you blue smoke, not black smoke. Black smoke is probably carbon buildup, but whatever. You're going to explain the relationship between given phenomena according to in causal terms. That's going to work. That's going to work. But when you push it to those ultimate terms, you take that concept that is meaningful in those terms and apply the words to try to satisfy your desire to answer something ultimate, but you end up getting something that is just meaningless. It's inherently contradictory, and the things you're asserting, you don't even know what you mean when you're saying that. You're just saying, and it goes on infinitely, and it goes on forever, or and there's a thing that's not caused. You can say those words, but they're ununderstandable. They're nonsense in that sense. I guess, yeah, I'll just read a little bit. So I'm actually going to read from 410 of the translation. I'm going to read from, first of all, right before A446 and B474, just at the punchline of the thesis. Actually, I'll go back. I'll read the thesis. So this is the very beginning. This is back A444, B472, page 49. So the thesis of the third conflict of the transcendental ideas. Thesis is that causality in accordance with the laws of nature is not the only causality from which the appearances of the world can one and all be derived. To explain these appearances, it is necessary to assume that there is another causality, which is freedom, where freedom means, I'm not talking about free will exactly, we'll talk about that in a minute, we just mean something that spontaneously, without being caused itself, sets in motion a series of causes. And the reason for this, and so how does one argue for the necessity of that? Well, one says, if you assume otherwise, it's incoherent. And that's the point about, if you always push things back from some conditioned thing to another conditioned thing, you're never actually going to get a sufficient explanation. So he ends up saying that most clearly right before A446, B474, on page 410, where he says, if therefore everything takes place solely in accordance with laws of nature, there will always be only a relative and never a first beginning, and consequently no completeness of the series on the side of causes that arise from one another. But the law of nature is just this, that nothing takes place without a cause sufficiently determined a priori. The proposition that no causality is possible save in accordance with the laws of nature, when taken in its unlimited universality, is therefore self-contradictory, and this cannot therefore be regarded as the sole kind of causality. So I'm just trying to show you in Kant's words that he's saying the same thing I said. Let's go back to 409. This is now A445, the antithesis. Oh, sorry, actually, you know what? I made a mistake. I was saying that was Uh, that last thing I read began at the end of A445. It actually began at the end of A444. Sorry about that, because we looked at page 44 of 46, where the one column is being written, and page 45 and 47, where the other column is being written. Sorry about that. Anyway, so now let's go to A445. Still on 409 in the translation. The antithesis is there is no freedom in the sense of that spontaneous cause. Everything in the world takes place solely in accordance with nature. And the conclusion here, which is right before A447, so the bottom of A445, is transcendental freedom thus stands opposed to the law of causality, and the kind of connection which it assumes as holding between the successive states of the active causes renders all unity of experience impossible. If you have something that brings things into being without itself being integrated in the series of causality, what you've said is the order of causality is shot. It's not a closed system, and therefore you can't ever be making sense of things. So the whole unity of your experience, the whole way that the reality makes sense, is that things are meaningfully causally integrated. If you introduce this notion of a spontaneous thing, which is kind of like the notion of miracle or something, you've thrown that out the door. That's enough. There's more to read now, sure, but that's a pretty simple argument. The arguments on the pages are pretty simple, and I think the points I'm making are simple enough that you should be able to follow that pretty clearly. So that's our first direct engagement with dialectic of reason. In other words, that's where we see it's not the first one he's talked about, it's the first one we've talked about, where Kant is showing you how, when we try to use the power of reasoning that we have, which is the impulsion to grasp things in ultimate unconditioned terms, we lead ourselves into contradiction. Trying to reason about ultimate cause forces you to produce two completely opposed arguments, each of which is equally compelling and each of which is impossible. Similar things happen with respect to the three other kinds of categories. So that was the categories of relations, specifically causality, but the same thing happens with quantity, modality, and so on. He writes about so that's a basic phenomenon of our experience. How are we supposed to understand that? What's going on there? Well, he writes about that in great detail. So he has many, many pages talking to you about why this happens. Of course, we've already more or less talked about that. But what's at stake in it, what the significance of these different arguments is, and so on. And that stuff is really great. I'm not going to go into. I'll say one thing about it. One of the things he tries to show you is that the two sides of each antinomy are always essentially the rationalism and empiricism. Like, one is based on relying on the power of reasoning to produce knowledge about the world, where you think, since I can reason to this conclusion, it must be a fact. The other is based, so that's what he says is basically a rationalist side. The other is basically what he calls an empiricist side, where the idea there is that you can't go beyond the evidence of immediate experience, and that always leads you not to be able to make those big ultimate points or something. The reason I mention that is Kant in this has begun, as far as I know, the recognition that there are problematic ways we are drawn to think about our experience that are effectively the rationalist approach and the empiricist approach, each of which is based on an error. And I've tried to talk earlier about what that error is, where it has to do with failing to honestly acknowledge the experiential context of our engagement with the real, that is our engagement with the real, and failure, therefore, to think in the terms of experience, and instead simply taking the terms of the object of experience, the terms of the real, and trying to use them to explain experience. And therefore, so you basically get very developed forms of transcendental realism, very developed forms of empirical idealism, I guess, are the things that can come out of that. Anyway, that's roughly where rationalism and empiricism as traditions of thinking come from. I'm not so much talking about the philosophers from the 17th and 18th century who are called rationalists and empiricists. Well, I don't know that they're rightly called that. Maybe they are. But I'm talking more about general intellectual traditions, how we try to solve problems and questions that come up for us in our everyday life. And Kant has identified these two as basically the vices of knowing, for lack of a better term, the vices of thinking. And he's trying to show around all these big issues that it's going to be played out this problematic way, and it's at the same time going to be played out this problematic way, and thought about the consequences of that. I mention that because that way of thinking about things is then runs throughout a lot of subsequent phenomenological, or at least European philosophy. Hegel doesn't do it in quite those terms, but Fichte does it in pretty much exactly those terms. Bergson does it in those terms, and Merleau-Ponty, about whom we'll talk a bit later, also does it in those terms. So that is to say, the way those people take up problems is they say, here's the thing that comes up in our life. How do we think about that? Well, they'll say, well, here's one way we think about it, and here's another way we think about it, and they'll sort of play out the everyday ways we do think about things that are effectively rationalist or empiricist in the sense I've given, and they will try to show concretely the problems in those ways of thinking and why those problems point to another thing that has to be acknowledged, and that will essentially be the phenomenological solution. That method of proceeding, which has marked out so much of European thinking for the last 200 years, that's what Kant pioneered, inaugurated, whatever the right word is, here in the section on the Antinomies in particular. So I mentioned that you might want to read those sections aside from their intrinsic interest to start seeing that. But anyway, I'm not going to read through that. I want to skip ahead to his later discussion of the third antinomy, which goes in the discussion of the antinomies goes on for a long time. I want to go back to where he revisits that antinomy, the third antinomy, and wants to talk about what he calls the solution to it. And so that actually starts on page 464 of the Kent Smith translation. That's A 532, B 500. And that's section 3 of whatever section we're in. It's called The Solution of the Cosmological Idea of Totality in the Derivation of Cosmical Events from Their Causes. So there, from 464 up until about 479, I think, he's going to give what is essentially the transcendental idealist interpretation of these things, which solves the problem. I would call it the phenomenological solution. But before doing that, I want to read a thing that comes right before that. This starts on page 461. So this is the end of his discussion of the first and second antinomies. Actually, I might want to read one more short thing if I can find it quickly. Give me one moment. Oh no, that's fine. I'll go from here. Here, I want to remind you again of something else we talked about last time that got us into talking about reality and nature and so on. And that was the distinction between the mathematical and the dynamical categories. So he said there that the categories of quantity and quality are basically about the parameters that are constitutive of something being it at all, being able to be present, the categories of presence, the categories of immediacy. Whereas the dynamical categories, he said, were the categories of the existence of objects, which is to say how immediate presences stand in relation, I guess, to other immediate presences or something like that. Anyway, they were the categories of necessity, possibility, actuality, substance and accident, cause and effect, reciprocity, relation and modality. Anyway, I hope you remember that. That was a big part of what I was talking about last time. So what he's going to say here now is a very, very remarkable and interesting thing, and that is that the contradictions that emerge from the antinomies of reason, the contradictions that emerge when reason tries to take categories that meaningfully function within experience, but it tries to take them to unconditioned use. That is to say, it tries to take away the condition of experience and ask about them in ultimate terms, beyond the conditions of any possible experience. It's led to antinomies. That is to say, it's led to statements of conflicting theses, right? Here he says that the contradiction that results in those, the contradiction that results when reason tries to use the mathematical categories unconditionally has a different significance than the contradiction that results when reason tries to use the dynamical categories unconditionally. And the point is that the contradiction surrounding those constitutive principles is just a contradiction, and both conclusions are simply false. The very interesting thing is that the opposed statements, the antinomial statements that come from trying to use the dynamical categories unconditionally, produces results that at one level oppose each other, but that in fact can both be true. And that's pretty interesting. So I'm going to read him a little bit when he says that. So here he said, I'm going to read actually substantial paragraphs. So we'll go on for a little while, but he's going to say the thing I just said, but I want you to hear his words. So this is A528, B556. It's page 461 in the Kemp-Smith translation. And this is the section at the end of talking about the first two antinomies. This is the section called Concluding Note on the Solution of the Mathematical Transcendental Ideas and Preliminary Observation on the Solution of the Dynamical Transcendental Ideas. So he says, in representing the antinomy of pure reason through all the transcendental ideas in tabular form, and in showing that the ground of this conflict and the only means of removing it is by declaring both the opposed assertions to be false, we have represented the conditions as, in all cases, standing to the conditioned in relations of space and time. This is the assumption ordinarily made by the common understanding, and to it the conflict is exclusively due. On this view, all the dialectical representations of totality in a series of conditions for a given condition are throughout of the same character. The condition is always a member of a series along with the condition, and so is homogeneous with it. Actually, I think I don't want to keep reading on and on there. I think I want to skip ahead because I'd be reading you too much. Yeah, so actually let me skip ahead. I'm sorry about that. He says in the next paragraph, he says, but in all this we have been overlooking an essential distinction that obtains among the objects, that is, among those concepts of understanding which reason endeavors to raise to ideas. According to the table of categories given above, two of these concepts imply a mathematical, the other two a dynamical synthesis of appearances. Hitherto it has not been necessary to take account of this distinction. But now that we are proceeding to consider how far dynamical concepts of the understanding are adequate to the idea of reason, the distinction becomes of importance and opens up to us an entirely new view of the suit in which reason is implicated. This suit, in our previous trial of it, has been dismissed as resting on both sides on false propositions. In other words, we were taking reason to court and dismissed its case. But since in the dynamical antinomy, a presupposition compatible with the pretensions of reason may perhaps be found, and since the judge may perhaps make good what is lacking in the pleas which both sides have been guilty of misstating, the suit may be settled to the satisfaction of both parties. Let me skip a little bit farther ahead, and now he's going to talk about the synthesis of the heterogeneous. I stopped reading because it was just going to go on and on too far. But the point he's actually making is an important one, but you can read it yourself to find it. I'm going to skip the next part where he continues as well, but it has to do with what's heterogeneous and what's homogeneous. But let's just skip ahead just to the point. here. He says, inasmuch, this is now on 463, A 531, B 559. He says, inasmuch as the dynamical ideas allow of a condition of appearances outside the series of the appearances, that is, a condition which is not itself appearance, we arrive at a conclusion altogether different from any that was possible in the case of a mathematical antinomy. In a mathematical antinomy, we were obliged to denounce both the opposed dialectical assertions as false. In a dynamical series, on the other hand, ... we are able to obtain satisfaction for understanding on the one hand and for reason on the other. The dialectical arguments, which in one or other way sought the unconditioned totality and mere appearance, fall to the ground, and the propositions of reason, when thus given this more correct interpretation, may both alike be true. Anyway, so that was a lot of long-winded reading, but I hope you'll go back and read that section because that's a pretty important point. Something is very different when you try to extend the dynamical concepts to unconditioned use and when you try to extend the mathematical ones that way. And in particular, we're just focusing on cause. And so now I only want to bring out with respect to the third antinomy about freedom, a free, that is to say, a spontaneous cause versus the infinite causal series. Everything you find is caused. I want to take that opposition and look at the very powerful and remarkable and insightful way he talks about how those two can both be true. Those two sides can both be true. So, and this is now the final point, I guess. So here, so this is now the solution of the cosmological idea of totality and the derivation of cosmical events from their causes. And this is page 464 to 479. It's one of the, it's a really exciting part of the Critique of Pure Reason. So you should always read those pages for sure. Okay. So first of all, let me begin with the same remark he begins with. When he's talking about freedom, mostly that means the bare idea of something that spontaneously can originate, some series of events without itself having a cause. Right? So it's that spontaneity of origination. That's a little different from our everyday use of freedom when we mean free will. They're closely related, but they're not quite the same. And so it's just important to remember them. And we and I often use freedom just to mean freedom of the will. That's fine. But remember that freedom as such doesn't always mean freedom of the will. It just means spontaneousness, right? And so he says, by freedom, in its cosmological meaning, I understand the power of beginning a state spontaneously. Freedom in this sense is a pure transcendental idea, contains nothing borrowed from experience. And it also refers to an object that cannot be determined or given in any experience. That's interesting. Because everything that happens in experience is the very meaning of the only way you can experience this is that it's part of a system of causal relations. Yeah? So that's the starting point. Then he says, that was 464, the beginning of this section. So that's A533, B501. Now, the next page, the end of those German pages, the next Kemp Smith page. It should especially be noted that the practical concept of freedom, what we mean by free will or freedom in practice, is based on that transcendental idea. And that it's that in that latter, in that idea, that the real source of the difficulty rests. Freedom in the practical sense is the will's independence of coercion through sensible impulses. And he says, when he says, there is in man a power of self-determination independently of any coercion through sensible impulses. We are free. We have free and then blah, blah, blah. Okay, we'll just read ahead a little bit here. Okay, yeah. So now let's go back. We're gonna get back to our free will in just a moment. But I want to go back to the point he made when he said antinomies with respect to dynamical concepts can be solved. Both sides can be true and taken up in the right way. So let's go back to that. So this is on page 466. So this is now right at the end of 435, A435, A535 in the beginning of A536, or the end of B563 and the beginning of B564. But he says, but the dynamical concepts of reason with which we have to deal in this in the following section, the dynamical concepts of reason possess this peculiarity, that they are not concerned with an object considered as a magnitude, but only with its existence. Or we could even say with an object considered as a presence, but only with its existence. Accordingly, we can abstract from the magnitude of the series of conditions, or we can abstract from the presence of the series, the immediacy of the series of conditions, and consider only the dynamical relation of the condition to the conditioned. The difficulty that then meets us in dealing with the question regarding nature and freedom is whether freedom is possible at all, and if it be possible, whether it can exist along with the universality of the nature of causality. So then he asks the question, is it a truly disjunctive proposition to say that every effect in the world must arise either from nature or from freedom? Or must we not rather say that in one and the same event, in different relations, both can be found? That's going to be the point we're going to make. Now, let's go back. I'm going to read a little bit more. This is still just backtracking. The next thing he says is not pushing ahead, but I want to read it because he's going to use almost exactly the same language I used, and so it should make sense when I read it. Remember, I said that the mistake people make is that instead of treating nature as a presentation, they treat it as a thing in itself, etc., etc. So he says, at the further down on that page, he says, for if appearances are things in themselves, freedom cannot be upheld. Nature will then be a complete and sufficient determining cause for every event. The condition of the event will be such as can be found only in the series of appearances. Both it and its effect will be necessary in accordance with the law of nature. If, on the other hand, appearances are not taken for more than they actually are, if they are viewed not as things in themselves, but merely as presentations connected according to empirical laws, they must themselves have grounds which are not appearances. The effect of such an intelligible cause The effects of such an intelligible cause appear and accordingly can be determined through other appearances, but its causality is not so determined. I mean, I guess the point there is if they're presentations, then you need to ask, what is the source of presentations? And that's different than seeing a stone and asking what is the source of the stone. When you're asking what is the source of the presentation of a stone, it's a different kind of question. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but I'm just going to leave it there. Anyway, I wanted to read you that material because that's the preliminary material setting the stage for the solution he's now going to offer. So now let's look at the next section that begins there, which is the possibility of causality through freedom in harmony with the universal law of natural necessity. So he says, whatever in an object of the senses is not itself appearance, I entitle intelligible. If therefore, so I have this marked off here, right? Listen to this. If therefore, that which in the sensible world must be regarded as appearance, has in itself a faculty which is not an object of sensual and sensible intuition, but through which it can be the cause of appearances, the causality of this being can be regarded from 2 points of view. I'm going to explain, I'm not going to unpack the sentence, I'm going to explain that, but I marked it as a thing for you to read. So let's think about whether we can find something in the world that might have more to it. Hold on, let me find the. I'm looking for a quotation. I'm not immediately seeing. Oh, I can't find it. Never mind. Now I'm looking for another quotation about a human being. Well, let me go back and read this. So this is right at the bottom of 467 in Kemp Smith. This is right at A539, B507. I won't read what comes before. Well, actually, I will. I was reading a quotation and I stopped reading because, again, it was going to go on too long, but I want to go back and read a little bit more. So he said, you can imagine a thing in the sensible world that has more to it. And he said, regarded as the causality of a thing in itself, it is intelligible in its action. Regarded as the causality of an appearance in the world of sense, it is sensible in its effects. We should therefore have to form both an empirical and an intellectual concept of the causality of the faculty of such a subject, and regard both as referring to one and the same effect. This twofold manner of conceiving the faculty does not contradict any of the concepts we have of appearances out of that. For since appearances are not things in themselves, they must rest upon a transcendental object. Consequently, there is nothing to prevent us from ascribing to this transcendental object, besides the qualities in terms of which it appears, a causality which is not appearance, although its effect is to be met within appearance. So he said you can imagine something that has kind of originating power, where that power itself is something that you could never sense, you could never see. All you could see are its effects, but its effects would have to answer to the laws of coherence and cohesion with other appearances. And so he says, in that case, this is now, halfway down the next page. The intelligible character could never be immediately known. I'm just trying to pull out a few quotations that you can go back and read, and then I'm going to say some things about them. And I'm still looking for a particular one which I haven't spotted yet. So he says, so imagine a thing where the thing is sensible. You can recognize that thing existing. It's a thing that exists in your world. It's intuitable. But it itself does have the ability to originate. Its ability to originate is not something you could ever see. It could originate something, and what it originates would then become something apparent. Those appearances would have to be appropriate, can very well be appropriately integrated with other appearances, but their source may be something that, though you can't see it, is free. And he says, if you think about, but he says it now. He says that one more thing. If you now think about that origination, that origination is not really an event in the series. It's not one. It's not one of the things that happens in the world of appearing things. So it's not like there's a thing that it's not like there is one of the things of the world in that being that's somehow in the world. So he says, no action begins in this active being, but we might very well say that the active being of itself begins its effects in the sensible world. Just pulling you to those quotations. Okay, so that's enough of those quotations. Now, let me find the sentence I'm after. It's funny, it's such a central sentence. Yeah, okay, so here we go. So now, finally, let's get to page 472. This is A 546B 574. Those have just been I've just been drawing your attention to a few places where he's sort of conceptually trying to talk about how we could think about the difference between appearances, which all will conform to the law of causality, and an origination, which is not itself one of the things in that sequence of appearances. So you can go back and read that. I wanted to point to a few key sentences, but you got to sit down and go through it. But now let's just get to what that's all about. So he says here on the page I just said, 472, which is A 546B 574, let us apply this to experience. Man, human being, is one of the appearances of the sensible world. So people appear to you as you appear to yourself, I guess. And insofar, is one of the natural causes, the causality of which must stand under empirical laws. Like all other things in nature, he must have an empirical character. He defined empirical character a couple of pages back. That it must subject belonging to the sensible world must have an empirical character whereby its actions as appearances stand in thoroughgoing connection with other appearances. That's what it means to be something that can appear. Like all things in nature, human being must have an empirical character. This character we come to know through the powers and faculties which he reveals in his actions. Notice, all you see is arms moving and legs flying, but we see those things as revealing various powers, and that's what happens with dog and cat too. Right? It's just what's revealed with the man is a little different. In lifeless or merely animal nature, we find no ground for thinking that any faculty is conditioned otherwise than in a merely sensible manner. When you look at the rest of the world, you see, this is going back to things we talked about last week about talking about instinct and so on. In the rest of the world, like you see things, the things that you would call actions, or perhaps better, just behavior of other living beings, still involve the bringing to bear on experience. Like, I can't think of the right word here, on appearance, I guess, of something kind of a priori. But there's it's given for the dog and the cat how things are going to be interpreted. And so it seems like if as I said with the cat, you see something like this, you pounce on it, right? Those correlations are the meanings that are integral to the experience of cat or whatever, right? And that, as far as we can tell, observing the world of nature, that's what we see. If you see something else, well, that's fine, and maybe there are other free beings, but that's what we see. So in lifeless or merely animal nature, we find no ground for thinking that any faculty is conditioned otherwise than in a merely sensible manner. That's effectively what that means. We see instinct. Man, however, who knows all the rest of nature solely through the senses, knows himself also through pure apperception, pure self-consciousness, pure self-awareness. And this indeed in acts and indeterminations which he cannot regard as repressions of the senses. He is thus to himself, on the one hand, phenomenon, a thing you see happening in the world. You see your hand moving, turns out you did this, etc., etc. But on the other hand, in respect of certain faculties, the action of which cannot be ascribed to the receptivity of sensibility, a purely intelligible object. I mean, you can recognize about yourself also that you reason, and more especially, the thing that's going to matter is that you experience moral imperatives. So you find out about yourself that there's something going on more than what you're able to recognize in other animals. That's like something you recognize in yourself. You see these same sort of sensible things, but you also find yourself open to something else. Um, those things we find in ourselves, we entitle these faculties understanding and reason, and our action is shaped by how we understand things and how we reason. Right? The latter, reason, in particular, we distinguish in a quite peculiar and special way from all empirically conditioned powers, for it views its objects exclusively in the light of ideas. That's what he was saying. That's what I was saying before when I said reason is about dealing with things in unconditional terms. We precisely have a power of taking things out of any sensible conditions. That our reason has causality, or that we at least represent it to ourselves as having causality, is evident from the imperatives, which in all matters of conduct we impose upon our as rules upon our active powers, the ought. Yeah, we impose, but again, it's a little bit more passive. Like, yes, it's in a way up to us whether or not we hold ourselves to those imperatives, but the imperatives are not things we make up. We find ourselves summoned to act in certain ways. Right? So that's another thing we discovered. Um, um, so I wanted to bring you to that part now, which is again Kant involving himself in the description of the form our experience takes, and the difference between the way in which we experience the rest of the living nature and the form our experience of ourselves has, specifically with respect to those aspects of our experience that are not a matter of observing sensible change, but are a matter of finding ourselves answerable to the imperatives of understanding and reason. Um, uh, one more thing. Okay. There are a lot. Yeah, I mean, I could read quite a few more pages in there, passages. I'm not going to read them. I want to just talk a little bit about the basic set of things. And having set all that up, I want to just draw this last conclusion. So the point that he finally wants to make here then is that um, um, well, let me read that one line again, assuming I can find it. Yeah, this was on A540, B568, page 468, about 10 lines up. He says, the intelligible character can never be immediately known. Intelligible character was a subject can have an intelligible character by which it is indeed the cause of those actions as appearances, but which does not itself stand under any conditions of sensibility and is not itself appearance. We can entitle the empirical character the character of the thing in the field of appearance. The intelligible character its character is the thing in itself. But yeah, anyway, and I said the intelligible character can never be immediately known. The point is then is this, that you can you can engage with the world of appearance, try to understand the things that you see, and when you do that, you will find that they belong to the world of nature and uh, uh, fit within the terms in which natural phenomena can happen. Uh, if they didn't, they would violate those rules, and then suddenly you would have no coherent experience of nature at all. But that's not the case. And so, when your hand moves around, like it does that in accordance with the laws of physics and whatever else. But conforming with the rules of possible empirical behavior is not, and that's where this causality and the sequence hold sway is not the same as identifying the source or origination of that. And so he says the it's it's quite possible for origination to happen, but that is not itself something that would or could ever be sensible. So causality in that sense, spontaneous causality to happen, but for causality always take the form of effects that fit into the order of nature, fit into the order of the world. And what that means is the way that you would recognize or apprehend freedom is not the same kind of way that you apprehend natural change or alteration or anything like that. And so his point here then is that the it doesn't have to be incompatible for you to be free, to be self-determining, and for everything you do to be an action in the natural world that fits within the terms of the natural world. And that's the last point now that I want to make. I just want to talk about that that idea of the same event where conceived in different ways, both coherence with natural causality and free origination can be possible. So I want you to think about free origination, period. Again, ignore free will for the moment, but think about creativity. Imagine a novel. Imagine somebody wrote a new novel. It's still going to be in English, and assuming a normal novel, no sentence will violate the rules of grammar. All the words will fit together the way they should, And yet, the thing said there is a new thing. The new thing in that it's something originally coming from the author. Not just at the level of sentences in the book, though, even at the level of ideas. It's a new idea, but it's a new idea that will fit with other ideas. And when you get whatever story you got out of that novel, it's going to fit together with your perception of the world in general, and the kinds of events that will unfold will fit with the other kinds of events. When you get a new idea from philosophy, it's new, and yet it's going to the way you're going to think about things is going to fit with the things you've already had to deal with, and so on. I'm just trying to sum up a few things so that you can start to see this idea that if we could call it, let's call it this, the phenomenon of freedom, by which I mean, I'm using that expression to say the phenomenon, the actual thing that appears, which is an effect of freedom, is a phenomenon like any other. It fits and coheres with the world, even though it came into being as a result of spontaneous origination. So if you think about any human action, human action will always be something that is like everything about a human being that happens in the world is a natural change. This set of bone and flesh, you can't see it, this set of bone and flesh, moved like this. These eyes went up and down. All you have ever encountered anywhere, ever, any time is in your cognizing of your experience is bits of nature moving in naturally coherent ways. And yet that has also been your experience of you as a human being engaging with other human beings. It's been lots of other things too, but it has been that. And so the thing is, you experiencing yourself as a human being, the sense of being a free source of origination, you experiencing yourself as engaging with other human beings as free sources of origination and so on. That hasn't been the encounter of a different piece of the natural world beside other things. It's not like that. It's rather been a kind of meaning you've engaged in as the sort of sense of what these material natural changes are, that is not itself something you've ever been able to apprehend immediately. You can't see somebody else's freedom. You can't see that somebody else is a person exactly. But your experience of yourself as a free being, engaging with other people as a free being, has always been of a different character than your perceptual and cognitive experience, which has been your recognition of yourself as a body coming into contact with other bodies and so on. I'm going to play that issue out more in a different context later. So mostly that's all I want to say here now, that if you think about what you ever meant by freedom, you never meant anything that shows up in any way other than as events in the world that completely cohere with the order of nature. Right? That freedom was always that form. In looking for freedom, you were never looking for anything other than the regular flow of coherent experience of natural bodies in the world. It's just that the meaning of those things that you were perceiving and understanding is a little bit is distinctive for certain reasons. So I want you to think about that idea that the point he wants to make here is that at a conceptual level, the existence of freedom is not incompatible with the experience taking the form of always having a coherent natural world. So first of all, that's a kind of a logical point, and that's what he talks about quite extensively in these pages. The second point is that you have an experience of yourself, not straightforward knowing or cognitive experience. Right? You don't have any sense impressions that you then interpret on, but in some other way, in your apperception, you experience yourself as a being who understands and reasons, which is a different order of things. And in particular, in the context of moral life, in particular, you have a moral life. You experience yourself as impinged upon by moral imperatives that are themselves unconditioned. They are matters of reason. Reason understood as the ability to apprehend things that are unconditioned. So I'm going to conclude with announcing a further study and saying where this took us. This book was about, our knowledge of the world of nature or something like that, roughly. And we have seen that it's always the case that we experience a real world in space, in time, right, of nature, and so on. And in particular, then, what we've been looking at is the limits of that. We have first been very careful to ask, how is it that we're able to have such an experience? And in so doing, we've really focused on the fact that it is an experience. And holding on to that recognition has been crucial to recognize the limits of what kind of claims we can make about it, and why we need to recognize that you can't remove the fact that you find yourself answerable to the world of nature, and you're going to have to learn how to act on its terms and so on. And you got your science to figure out how to do it and try to find cures for coronavirus and so on. That's all matters of science. That's all matter of exposure to reality. It's very real. But we've learned that the fact that we have that experience means, it's taught us something about what it means to refer to knowledge. And we've seen the limits of knowledge. And we've seen, in fact, the limits of, let's just say that, the limits of knowledge. In looking in particular at some of these things in the dialectic of reason, specifically the antinomy, we've looked at how our attempts to push that project of knowing in ways that our reason makes us think initially it should work, lead us into problems if we are dishonest about the experiential context of our exposure to nature. So that's the story of knowledge of reality as a kind of object and its limits. But at its limit, we find something else. We find that compatible with that experience is an experience of ourselves as free. It's never a matter of knowing an object in the way that we've been talking about knowing nature, but it's a different kind of experience in which other sorts of meanings are available to us that are not that kind of meaning. So this third antinomy has really been about showing the earlier part was about showing the necessity. This is about showing the limits of that experiencing of the object and the knowledge of the object, and opening and in finding that limit, opening the door to other kinds of experience that are not that. I'm not going to go talk about that now, but that's what would be opened up, especially by the discussion of moral experience. I want to refer you to it if you're interested. I hope you are interested. I have another lecture from some years ago that a friend of mine just happened to tape when I gave it. I had no intention otherwise of doing it. It's just the beginning of a conference or seminar. But it's a lecture. Essentially, would be the next lecture in this series, and it's about more detail about these ideas of reason and especially how they pertain to moral life. That lecture is called "The Meaning of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason." And you can find it on YouTube. And that would be actually quite naturally the one to listen to after that. And I think if you listen to that, you're going to have that's piece number 5. Like you're going to have pretty much the whole picture. All I want to say is finish this. Like with Kant, I wanted to bring us into the basic project of this book, introduce this, what I'm considering a kind of phenomenological investigation, and bring out the basic parameters of that. And get us to the point of thinking about the experience of freedom and how the recognition of freedom by freedom is not like the cognition of objective nature. That then is a theme we're going to move on to. We're going to take that up in relationship to Hegel a bit. So that's where we're going to go. Last thing, two things. Last thing about Kant, and then just think about the cover image. About Kant, I recommend you go back now and read the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. I think if once you get to this point in the book that we're at, you kind of understand the book, and then if you go back to the preface, you'll understand what he's saying there, because that preface really does talk about all these ideas, but if you've never read the book, it'd be hard to get them. And I especially want to point you to pages 26 to 29 as a sort of pointer to what I was just launching, right? The idea of moral experience. He's talked about these ideas of reason, or whatever comes out of reason, and the problems associated with that in relationship to cognition of nature. But reason has so in the context, in relationship to cognition, reason has mostly a negative function. Like mostly what he has to do is show why you can't learn about nature by trying to reason about it, right? Reasoning doesn't produce knowledge, ever. It's not a source of knowledge. You should be answerable to the rules of reasoning when you are operating within the terms of nature and trying to understand it and so on. But you can't turn to your reason and say, since I reasoned this out, it must be a fact. And that he's been trying to prove why that's so. So reason is not a source of knowledge. And in that sense, the critique of pure reason with respect to cognition is a negative one, is to show that reason is not a knowledge-giving faculty. But a practical reason, the critique of practical reason is quite different. In relationship to our action, reason is, in that sense, a productive faculty. Reason doesn't give us knowledge of the world, but it does give us imperatives that dictate forms of action to us. It's the voice of morality. So that's what that other book's about. And in that context, he talks about the specific ideals to which reason is pointed, and he says those are God, freedom, and immortality. When you see that, you're not really going to know what that means. That's okay. It doesn't hurt to think about them, but you're not going to know what they mean. That is the subject of that other lecture of mine that I referred to, the meaning of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. But anyway, but he'll talk about that a bit on pages 26 to 29 of the Kemp Smith, which is B 14, Roman numeral 14, this is from preface, to about 30, Roman numerals 24 to Roman numeral 30, Roman numerals 24 to 30. You might look at that for a little bit of the story of where it's going. Anyway, all I wanted to do today then was to identify reason and the attempt to go to the unconditioned as another tendency we have, but as one that is really risks violating the very terms of meaningfulness that it depends upon. And that was the main thing I was talking about. I tried to play that out in one specific example from the third antinomy. And the point I wanted to make there initially was mostly just for you to see how you get contradictory answers. And that has shown the negative result from the point of view of cognition. And then I wanted to complete that story. But I also then wanted to introduce the other side, which is that even though from the point of view of knowledge you've thus reached this limit, the very way we've been thinking about this allows us to see that the intelligible reality of free causality does not have to be at odds with the demand of the unity of experience that everything take the form of a causally coherent world of nature. That I wanted to introduce as something you could begin to think about, and then I wanted to just point to the discussion of morality as where that might go. I'm going to leave it there, but we'll come back and next time, and we will take up freshly some of these questions about freedom and the recognition of freedom by freedom and what that involves. And I want to end just with the talking about the cover image. The image is a sculpture by Brancusi called The Kiss, and I want you there just to think about 2 points, and it has to do with this last thing I was saying. It's called The Kiss, and if in a way you know what that means, and you presumably you've done it, and you know what it is to do a kiss. But basically all it is one person's set of lips touching another person's set of lips. So I want you to look at that image and think about 2 things: the natural reality of lips touching lips, and the fact that that's describable entirely in natural terms, physical terms. But to distinguish that from what a kiss actually is, where it comes from and what it means and so on, and notice the difference between the kissing as collaborative and cooperative expression of freedom and the meaning that is being communicated between free beings by doing that, and the kiss as redistribution of the objects of nature completely consistently with the rules of nature. The same event understood in 2 different ways depending on which question you're asking. You can understand it in terms of the causal relationships, and you can understand it in terms of the expression of free intentions, free meaning. And then add one more layer. So that's the main point. And then add one more layer. The interesting thing about the artwork, and perhaps about all artwork, is pretty much the point I made about the key for last week, is that the artwork itself allows the rock to be a rock, like it doesn't change that, and it also manages to be the expression of a kiss, right? So there's really 3 layers, right? There's the rock just being rock, and the rock is a presentation of a kiss as a physiological phenomenon, and that physiological phenomenon is the expression of a free action. Right? So basically, the ability of the rock to be an image, or in the case of the Kiefer painting, the oil on canvas to be an image, is very closely analogous to the ability of a physiological event to be the expression of an act of freedom. So I wanted, again, just to get you to think about that artwork as a way of seeing, well, I guess you don't immediately see, but of being able to recognize in something more familiar to you this sort of doubleness of meaning or doubleness of relation, something that on the one hand accords with the rules of physical nature, but on the other hand is an expression of freedom. Okay, I'll leave it there, and we'll pick up next time.